This video is made for entertainment purposes only.
Hey, step away from the SUV. Who does this belong to?
It's mine, officer. What's the reason you're stopping?
I need ID, now.
Before I reach for anything, give me your badge number.
Don't get difficult.
I'm State Senator Darius
Call your
Whitfield.
supervisor to my location.
The bodycam footage is grainy but unmistakable. A man stands beside a dark blue Lexus GX, one hand still on the open trunk, a single grocery bag visible inside. His posture is relaxed, his expression calm. The officer's voice cuts through the evening air, sharp and accusatory. Hey, step away from the SUV. Who does this belong to? The man doesn't flinch. He turns slowly, meeting the camera's gaze with steady eyes. It's mine, officer. What's the reason you're stopping me? That question, delivered in a measured tone, would set off a chain reaction that would cost one officer everything he'd built and expose a system that had looked the other way for far too long. What happened in the 17 minutes that followed wasn't just another incident. It was the moment when assumptions collided with reality, when authority met accountability, and when a single interaction revealed cracks in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. The grocery store parking lot on Broad Street in Trenton, New Jersey would become the stage for a confrontation that would end a career, trigger a federal investigation, and force a city to reckon with questions it had been avoiding. But none of that was obvious yet. Not at 5:19 p.m. on that Monday evening, when Officer Brian Coyle made the decision to approach a man loading groceries into his own vehicle. The man standing beside the Lexus was Senator Darius Whitfield, though the officer didn't know that yet. At 49 years old, Whitfield had spent the better part of 2 decades in public service, first as a city councilman, then as a state assemblyman, and for the past 6 years as a state senator representing New Jersey's 15th district. He was known in the State House for his measured approach to legislation, his focus on criminal justice reform, and his reputation for listening before speaking. He wasn't flashy. He didn't court media attention or post constantly on social media. He did the work, built coalitions, and went home to a modest house in the Hamilton Park neighborhood where he'd lived for 23 years. On this particular Monday, Whitfield had taken advantage of a rare gap in his schedule. The legislative session had adjourned early, and instead of heading straight to his district office for the usual stack of constituent meetings, he decided to run a simple errand. His refrigerator was nearly empty. He needed milk, bread, eggs, and a few other basics. Nothing complicated. He'd driven to the grocery store on Broad Street, a place he'd shopped at hundreds of times over the years, parked near the entrance, and spent 15 minutes walking the aisles. He'd exchanged pleasantries with the cashier, a young man named Marcus who recognized him and thanked him for his work on a recent education bill. Whitfield had smiled, told Marcus to take care, and walked out into the late afternoon sunlight carrying a single reusable grocery bag. His Lexus GX wasn't new, but it was well maintained. He'd bought it used 3 years earlier after his previous vehicle, a 12-year-old Honda Accord, had finally given up. The Lexus had been a practical choice, reliable in winter weather and spacious enough to transport documents and materials when needed. The license plate frame, a simple black border with the words State Senate in white lettering, had come with the vehicle when he'd registered it. He'd never thought much about it. It was just a plate frame, a minor detail in a life filled with far more pressing concerns. Officer Brian Coyle had been with the Trenton Police Department for 6 years. At 32, he was still relatively young in his career, ambitious in the way many officers were at that stage. He'd grown up in a suburb 20 minutes outside Trenton, the son of a construction foreman and a school secretary. He'd played football in high school, served 4 years in the National Guard, and joined the police force after deciding college wasn't for him. His record was clean on paper. No major complaints, no excessive force allegations, no internal affairs investigations. But those who worked closely with him knew there was something else beneath the surface, a pattern of behavior that didn't always make it into official reports. Coyle had a tendency to see threats where none existed, to escalate situations that could have been diffused with conversation, to approach certain people with suspicion that seemed to have no basis in observable behavior. The call had come in at 5:17 p.m. Dispatch had relayed a vague report from an anonymous caller who described a suspicious person near an expensive SUV outside the grocery store at 215 Broad Street. The caller hadn't provided specific details about what made the person suspicious, hadn't mentioned any criminal activity, hadn't described any threats or weapons. Just a feeling, transmitted through a phone line and filtered through dispatch protocol until it reached Coyle's radio as he cruised 2 blocks away. He'd responded immediately, turning onto Broad Street and scanning the parking lot as he approached. When Coyle spotted the dark blue Lexus and the man standing beside it, something clicked in his mind. The man was placing a grocery bag into the rear of the vehicle, a completely ordinary action performed thousands of times a day in parking lots across the country. But Coyle's first thought wasn't about groceries or routine errands. His first thought was that the man didn't look like he belonged with that vehicle. It was a thought Coyle didn't examine, didn't question, didn't recognize as the bias it was. He simply acted on it, pulling his cruiser to a stop 30 feet away and stepping out with the confidence of someone certain he was about to prevent a crime. "Hey, step away from the SUV. Who does this belong to?" Coyle's voice carried across the parking lot, loud enough to turn heads. A woman pushing a shopping cart paused and looked over. A teenager loading bags into a sedan nearby glanced up, then quickly looked away, the universal reaction of someone who didn't want to get involved. Whitfield turned slowly, his hand still resting on the open trunk. He took in the officer's approach, the body language, the tone. He'd been a black man in America for 49 years. He knew this script, had lived through variations of it more times than he could count. But he also knew his rights, knew the law with the precision of someone who'd spent years writing and amending it, and knew that how he responded in the next few seconds would determine the trajectory of everything that followed. "It's mine, officer. What's the reason you're stopping me?" Whitfield's voice was calm, almost conversational. He didn't move toward the officer or away from the vehicle. He simply stood there, waiting for an answer that should have been straightforward. Coyle was already closer now, his hand resting on his duty belt, his eyes scanning Whitfield and the Lexus with undisguised suspicion. "I need ID. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the assumption of automatic compliance. Whitfield didn't reach for his wallet. Not yet. Because he understood something crucial that many people never learn until it's too late: the order in which things happen matters. The legal framework matters. The record matters. Have you ever witnessed something like this? Type "record" in the comments if this feels familiar. "Before I reach for anything, give me your badge number," Whitfield said. His tone hadn't changed. Still calm. Still measured. But there was steel underneath now, the voice of someone who understood power and wasn't intimidated by its display. Coyle's jaw tightened. This wasn't how these interactions usually went. People were supposed to fumble for their licenses, offer explanations, show deference. They weren't supposed to ask questions. They weren't supposed to know their rights with this kind of precision. "Don't get difficult," Coyle said, and there it was, the warning that preceded escalation, the suggestion that compliance was the only acceptable response. Whitfield saw the shift happening. He saw Coyle's hand move closer to his radio, saw the officer's stance widen slightly, the preparatory movement of someone getting ready to assert physical control. This was the moment when many interactions spiraled into violence, when fear or anger or simple misunderstanding transformed a conversation into a confrontation. But Whitfield had spent 20 years learning how to defuse exactly these situations, how to use words as tools, how to establish facts before emotions took over. "I'm State Senator Darius Whitfield. Call your supervisor. This is being recorded." He gestured with his chin toward the bodycam clipped to Coyle's uniform, then toward the grocery store entrance where a security camera hung under the awning, its lens pointed directly at them. The change in Coyle's expression was immediate and devastating. The confidence drained from his face like water from a broken glass. His eyes widened slightly. His hand, which had been moving toward his cuffs, froze mid-motion. For 3 full seconds, he simply stood there, processing what he'd just heard, running through the implications, understanding with growing horror that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Then, almost mechanically, he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor to my location." His voice had lost its authority. Now it just sounded uncertain, the voice of someone who knew he'd stepped into something far beyond his ability to control. Whitfield didn't move. He kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed but alert. Around them, the parking lot had become a stage. More people were watching now, phones appearing in hands, additional cameras capturing angles the bodycam would miss. A man loading groceries 3 cars away had his phone raised, filming openly. A woman sitting in her vehicle with the window down had stopped scrolling through her phone and was recording as well. In the age of viral videos and instant accountability, this moment was already being preserved from multiple perspectives, each angle adding to the record that would soon become evidence. What would you have done in this situation? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story will shock you even more. Sergeant Michael Torres arrived 6 minutes later. At 47, Torres had been with Trenton PD for 22 years, long enough to have seen most variations of police work, long enough to recognize a disaster when he saw one unfolding. He pulled up in his marked Supervisor vehicle and stepped out with the careful body language of someone assessing a volatile situation. He saw Coyle standing awkwardly near the Lexus, saw the well-dressed man with the grocery bag still in the open trunk, saw the phones recording from multiple angles, and understood immediately that this wasn't a routine stop gone slightly wrong. This was something much worse. "Senator Whitfield," Torres said, his tone respectful but cautious. He'd recognized Whitfield immediately. They'd actually met once before, at a community policing forum the senator had organized 2 years earlier. Torres had appreciated Whitfield's approach then, his willingness to listen to officers' perspectives while also pushing for reforms. Now he approached with the awareness that whatever had happened here would have consequences far beyond this parking lot. Whitfield nodded in acknowledgement but didn't smile. This wasn't a social interaction. This was documentation of official misconduct. "Sergeant, your officer stopped me while I was loading groceries into my own vehicle. He demanded identification without stating a reason for the stop. When I asked for his badge number and supervisor, he suggested I was being difficult. I'd like a full incident report, including the initial call that prompted this response." Torres glanced at Coyle, who was now staring at the ground like a student called to the principal's office. "Officer Coyle, step back to your vehicle." It was an order, not a suggestion. Coyle moved immediately, grateful for the excuse to retreat. Torres turned back to Whitfield. "Senator, I apologize for this interaction. Can I ask if you're willing to provide a statement?" Whitfield reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, pulling out a wallet that contained his driver's license and his state senate identification. "I'll provide whatever documentation you need. I'll also be filing a formal complaint through both your Internal Affairs Division and the Attorney General's office. This kind of profiling isn't just unprofessional. It's illegal. And it's exactly the pattern my office has been investigating." That last sentence hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Because what Officer Coyle didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd acted on assumption rather than information, was that Senator Darius Whitfield chaired the state Senate's Law Enforcement Oversight Committee. For the past 18 months, his office had been conducting a comprehensive review of policing practices across New Jersey, collecting data on traffic stops, use of force incidents, and complaint patterns. Trenton PD was one of the departments under review. And now, through his own actions, Officer Brian Coyle had provided a perfect case study of exactly the kind of discriminatory policing the committee was investigating. Torres knew this. Standing in that parking lot, listening to Whitfield's calm recitation of facts, Torres understood that this incident wouldn't be quietly resolved with an apology and a handshake. This would go up the chain of command. It would trigger formal investigations. It would generate media coverage. And it would likely end with consequences that would reverberate through the entire department. "I understand, Senator," Torres said quietly. "I'll ensure everything is properly documented. Is there anything else you need from us right now?" Whitfield shook his head. "Just the incident report number. I'll take care of the rest through appropriate channels." The 17-minute interaction ended with Whitfield driving away with his groceries, his demeanor unchanged, his routine barely disrupted. But for Officer Brian Coyle, sitting in his cruiser filling out paperwork under his sergeant's supervision, everything had changed. The adrenaline that had fueled his initial approach had curdled into nausea. His hands shook slightly as he wrote. He kept replaying the interaction in his mind, searching for the moment when he could have de-escalated, the point where he could have simply verified the plate registration and walked away. But that moment had passed before the interaction even began, lost in the assumptions he'd made when he first saw a black man standing beside an expensive vehicle. If you think consequences were deserved, type "justice" in the comments. The bodycam footage was reviewed that evening by the department's Internal Affairs Unit. The next morning, it was on the desk of Trenton's police chief, accompanied by a formal complaint from Senator Whitfield's office that outlined not just the specific incident but a pattern of similar stops conducted by Officer Coyle over the previous 2 years. The senator's staff had done thorough research. They'd pulled traffic stop data, cross-referenced it with demographic information, and identified a clear statistical pattern. Coyle stopped Black and Hispanic drivers at rates significantly higher than his peers, conducted searches at higher rates despite finding contraband at lower rates, and had received informal complaints from community members that had never been formally investigated. Chief Raymond Porter had been trying to modernize Trenton PD for 5 years, pushing reforms against institutional resistance and union pushback. He'd implemented new training protocols, brought in outside consultants, and established community oversight mechanisms. But he also knew that one officer's actions could undermine years of progress. When he watched the bodycam footage, he didn't see a gray area or a misunderstanding. He saw clear evidence of discriminatory policing, of an officer who'd made assumptions based on race rather than behavior, who'd escalated when he should have de-escalated, and who'd only shown concern when he realized his target had power. The investigation moved quickly. Within a week, Internal Affairs had compiled a comprehensive report documenting Coyle's pattern of problematic stops. Within 2 weeks, the New Jersey Attorney General's office had opened a parallel civil rights investigation. Within 3 weeks, Coyle had been placed on unpaid administrative leave. The police union initially moved to defend him, arguing for due process and presumption of innocence, but their position became increasingly untenable as more evidence emerged. The union's own attorneys, reviewing the footage and the statistical analysis, privately advised that this wasn't a case worth fighting to the bitter end. The civil lawsuit came 5 weeks after the parking lot encounter. Senator Whitfield didn't file it for himself. Instead, he'd connected with 6 other individuals who'd been stopped by Officer Coyle under similarly questionable circumstances over the past 3 years. The lawsuit named not just Coyle but the city of Trenton and the police department's leadership, arguing that inadequate supervision and failure to address pattern complaints constituted systemic negligence. The plaintiffs included a high school teacher who'd been searched during a traffic stop despite having no contraband, a small business owner who'd been detained for 20 minutes while walking in his own neighborhood, and a college student who'd been questioned aggressively while sitting in his car outside his parents' house. The city's attorneys reviewed the evidence and reached the same conclusion any objective observer would: they were going to lose. The bodycam footage alone was damning, but combined with the statistical pattern and the multiple witness accounts, the case was indefensible. Settlement negotiations began almost immediately. The question wasn't whether the city would pay, but how much and what structural changes would be required as part of any agreement. 3 months after that Monday evening in the grocery store parking lot, the settlement was announced. The total payout was $1.4 million, distributed among the 7 plaintiffs. Officer Brian Coyle was officially terminated, with provisions that would prevent him from being hired by any other law enforcement agency in New Jersey. The city agreed to implement comprehensive reforms including mandatory bias training, enhanced supervision protocols for officers with complaint patterns, and quarterly reporting to an independent oversight board. Chief Porter stood at the press conference announcing the settlement and acknowledged what many departments still refuse to admit, that individual officer bias, left unchecked, could poison an entire system's relationship with the community it served. Do you believe accountability was served or did it come too late? Share your perspective below. For Coyle, the termination and financial penalty were devastating. At 32, he'd built his entire adult identity around being a police officer. Now that identity was gone, replaced by the stigma of being fired for civil rights violations. He couldn't work in law enforcement anywhere in the state. Background checks for other jobs would surface the termination. His marriage, already strained by the stress of the investigation, collapsed 3 months later. He eventually moved out of state, taking a job in private security where his past was less likely to follow him. But the weight of that 17-minute interaction never fully lifted. In quiet moments, he still saw Senator Whitfield's calm face, heard his own voice demanding compliance, and understood how completely he'd destroyed his own future with assumptions he'd never bothered to examine. Senator Whitfield continued his work on the Law Enforcement Oversight Committee, using the parking lot incident as a catalyst for broader reforms across New Jersey. He testified before legislative committees, worked with community organizations, and pushed for laws that would make it easier to track and address officers with problematic patterns. But he also spoke candidly about the emotional toll of that evening, how even as an elected official with power and resources, he'd felt the familiar spike of fear when confronted by an aggressive officer, how he'd had to consciously control his breathing and tone while calculating the safest way to de-escalate a situation that never should have happened in the first place. The grocery store parking lot on Broad Street looked exactly the same a year later. The same security camera hung under the same awning. People still loaded groceries into their vehicles, completely unaware that this ordinary space had become the setting for an incident that had changed policies and ended a career. There was no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate what had happened there. But in police academies across the state, the bodycam footage became required viewing, a case study in how not to conduct a stop, how bias corrupts judgment, and how 17 minutes of poor decision-making can erase years of work. The broader questions raised by the incident lingered long after the settlement checks were cashed. And the policy reforms were implemented. How many similar stops had happened without bodycams or witnesses? How many people had been treated with suspicion not because of what they did but because of who they were? How many officers harbored the same biases as Coyle but had simply been lucky enough never to profile someone with the power to fight back? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were urgent practical concerns that communities across the country were grappling with, trying to rebuild trust that had been systematically eroded by exactly the kind of interaction that had unfolded outside a grocery store on a Monday evening. Senator Whitfield often said in interviews that followed that he didn't want to be seen as exceptional. The problem, he argued, wasn't that an officer had profiled a state senator. The problem was that officers were profiling people at all, that assumptions about criminality were being made based on skin color rather than actual behavior, and that the system had been designed to protect officers who acted on those assumptions rather than the people harmed by them. The fact that his title and position had given him tools to fight back didn't make the profiling acceptable. It made the thousands of similar stops experienced by people without those tools even more unjust. If this story opened your eyes or taught you something important, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like these matter. The legacy of those 17 minutes continues to unfold. The policy reforms implemented in Trenton became models studied by other departments. The statistical analysis methods developed to document Coyle's pattern were adopted by oversight bodies in other jurisdictions. The settlement created precedent that made similar cases easier to litigate. But perhaps most importantly, the incident became part of a larger national conversation about policing, bias, and accountability, a conversation that was slowly, painfully, beginning to change how law enforcement approached communities of color. Officer Brian Coyle made assumptions that Monday evening. He saw a man, a vehicle, and a disconnect his biased mind invented. He approached with authority instead of curiosity, with suspicion instead of respect, with commands instead of questions. And in doing so, he didn't just profile a state senator. He revealed the assumptions that had guided his policing all along, the pattern of bias that had affected dozens of people who never had the platform to fight back. The $1.4 million penalty and his termination weren't punishment for a single mistake. They were accountability for a pattern of injustice that should never have been allowed to continue as long as it did. The bodycam footage ends with Sergeant Torres' arrival, but the real story continued for months afterward, rippling through institutions and policies and individual lives. It serves as a reminder that no interaction is truly ordinary, that every moment of bias or assumption has consequences, and that sometimes justice comes not in spite of power imbalances but because someone with power refuses to accept treatment that too many others have been forced to endure in silence. The parking lot is still there. The groceries were eventually put away. But the questions raised that evening continue to demand answers, and the work of building a more just system continues, one difficult conversation and one hard one reform at a time.